So welcome everyone to our session on alternative grading and assessment practices as an aspect of UDL. I'm Lisa Del Tordo, and Veronica Burns, Megan Fritz, Anna Luce, and I will be co-facilitating the session today. So before I move on to our next slide, I hope you all have had a chance while we've been waiting to get started to look at the Piled Higher and Deeper comic that's up on the screen. I know that so many of us can relate to this experience of trying to grade as fairly as possible and just getting stuck. And that part at the end, I love. It says grading if only we cared a little less, but we don't, right? We care a lot, actually. And that's why we're here to talk about some alternatives today. So let me just quickly go over our plan, our agenda for this session. So we're going to start with some quick intros. Then we'll talk a little bit about the rationale for reconsidering assessments and grading. We'll then give an overview of a variety of approaches to grading. And what we mean in number 4 by case studies is Megan and Veronica are going to go into a bit more detail about a couple of aspects of the approaches that they've developed and implemented in their own classes. And then if we have time, we'll take a few minutes for you all to reflect on your own practices. And if not, we'll send you home with some questions that you can consider. And we'll wrap up by showing you some resources that we're providing to you on the UDL Canvas site. So we'll be doing a lot of talking. This session might have a little less engagement than some of the others that you've been to, but we should have some time for engagement at the end. And you can always feel free to throw stuff in the chat if questions come up as we're talking, and we'll figure out ways to address those. So as I said, Lisa Del Tordo, she, her pronouns. I've been teaching and grading in a few different kinds of courses, but mostly undergraduate writing courses for about 19 years. And I've been teaching in the Cook Family Writing Program at Northwestern for almost 13 years. And I'll give 3 words to describe how I feel about grading. So uneasy, excited, and hopeful. I have pretty much always felt uneasy about grading. And now that I have developed and started to implement some new approaches, I feel also excited and hopeful about it. So Veronica, do you want to go next? And then Megan and Anna?
Sure. My name is Veronica. I use she, her pronouns. And I'm an assistant professor of instruction in chemistry. So that means that I teach a lot of general chemistry, big lab classes as well. And so a lot of the grading that I do is done by TAs, not myself. So that creates its own challenges. And then there are also lab courses. So that's a different sort of type of grading. It's writing, but it's kind of different writing and a more technical side. So how do I feel about grading? I would say my first word that comes to mind is anxious. It always makes me anxious, but I love, I'm going to steal Lisa's word, hopeful, because I feel like we're starting to make changes in the chemistry department that give me hope about how we approach grading as a department. So I think we're going to Megan next.
Yeah, thanks so much. Hi, everybody. My name's Megan Fritz. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm an assistant professor of instruction in the Cook Family Writing Program. I teach probably the opposite side of Veronica's classes. So I'm also teaching a lot of intro level classes, a lot of first year writing seminars, but my seminars are really small, 15 or 16 students per. I also teach English 2D2, which is this writing and speaking and business class. It's the writing requirement for the BIP minor. So I teach a lot of required writing classes, a lot of younger students at Northwestern. I also help assist in directing the main library writing place, which is Northwestern's peer-to-peer writing center. It's another part of my job. 2 or 3 words to express how I feel about grading. I would say before I started using alternative assessment, I felt maybe like ineffective or disheartening is how I would associate my words with grades. But now as I've been doing more work and thinking differently about grades, I find them more creative and collaborative, especially among students. So thank you. Anna, you want to hop in?
Yes, thank you. So my name is Anna Luce. I'm a learning engineer in teaching and learning technologies, and I have a lot of background in online teaching in higher ed. And in my role here, I work with faculty on a variety of topics that relate to educational technology, including grading. And my feelings about grading, I would say over the last couple of years, I felt really betrayed by grades, because when I was young, I felt really good about grades, and gave me a big sense of pride that I got really good grades when I was younger. But now I'm sort of recognizing maybe they didn't mean exactly what I thought they meant. So I feel betrayed, but I also feel sort of strategic, because in some of the research that I've done and the folks that I've talked to, I've realized that there are some things we can do with assessment and grading that can have the outcomes that we're hoping for. And yeah, like everybody else sort of on the team today, I feel really hopeful about grading, because there are a lot of changes that we can make to improve our students' experiences around grading. And I use she, her pronouns. Okay, sorry, out of order. So the first thing we wanted to talk about today is why are we talking about grading differently? And in my opinion, I think rethinking grading and assessment, especially in the light of UDL principles and approaches, is a recognition that our current or traditional systems of grading are not teaching students or reaching students equitably or reaching all students effectively. So the current systems we have were created hundreds of years ago in a very different educational system, whose primary goal might have been to turn out folks that were really good factory workers. And so we're thinking about things differently because we are hoping to do better than things were in the past. And as you'll see through the initial part of this session today, research has demonstrated that our current grading systems are at first inaccurate, and second, not so great for learning. So what do I mean when I say that traditional grading systems are inaccurate? Well, to determine if something is accurate, you need to first decide what it is you want it to measure. So why do we give students grades? Do we give them grades to measure what their progress, what they have learned? Did they start here and end up here? Are we grading that progress? Are we reflecting what they have accomplished? Have they achieved a certain objective? Or maybe we're giving grades to motivate students, to reward them for hard work. Unfortunately, what research has shown is that our current system does not do that effectively. One book I really want to talk about quickly that sort of changed my thinking about grading is this book called Grading for Equity. And the first part of this book really approaches grading from a factual sort of mathematical approach. And it says, if we're going to grade equitably, if we're going to give students an assessment of their learning or their progress that is not couched in our personal biases, they need to mathematically represent some things truthfully. And so the book lays out in the beginning some sort of irrefutable facts about the way we have been grading for many years. And that is that identical academic performance can yield different grades. And what I mean by that is that students who perform identically on standardized assessments often get different grades in their class because their instructors are grading them based on participation or based on completing homework or things like that. And the converse is true, that variable academic performance or behavioral performance, so students who perform very differently on standardized tests, can yield identical grades. So identical performance can yield different grades, and variable performance can yield identical grades. So how could that be an accurate system if students who are behaving differently are getting the same grades, or students who are performing identically are getting different grades? There's a bullet point on here about omnibus grades. And in the book, there are many different calculations about different grading scenarios, but an omnibus grade is a grade you get for the whole quarter or the whole term that gives you a grade based on your participation and your homework and your engagement in class and different assignments. And then it gives you one single letter. So it distills all of this information into one letter or one percentage. And what that does is it sort of hides all of the perhaps valuable information from those different sections of the grade. It says you got a B in this class, but it doesn't tell you how you performed on those individual measurements. Group projects are a really great way to learn, but they're difficult to grade. Working together helps students progress and learn, but not every student is going to have an identical sort of performance at the end of a group project. And finally, evaluation is subjective. So it's really difficult to give grades that is not based on your personal biases or your hidden biases. So this is just an example of variable performance and identical grades. So one student gets full points for participation and performs really poorly on the final exam, while student B does really well on the exams, but doesn't turn in their homework and participation, and they both end up with an 80 in the class. So if you were just to look at those final grades, you would think that these students had comparable performance when in fact their performance was very different.
So the other kind of big scholarly branch of alternative assessment that we're going to be looking at today is the way that grades have been proven to be bad for learning. And they're behavioral psychologists, motivational psychologists, as well as scholars of education, find that grades can be actually detrimental to student learning in several ways. So grades have been shown to decrease intrinsic motivation for learning and replace it with the extrinsic motivation of getting a grade. So in other words, students become motivated by earning high grades rather than investing in their own learning and growth as students and individuals. Grades reduce the quality of thinking in students, encourages them to think less deeply about course content. So for example, students might skim readings or just learn what they need to know for the test, but nothing more, right? And so grades kind of discourage critical thinking and questioning, as students tend to focus only on what they think they need to understand to show for mastery of content rather than critically engaging with the curriculum. Grades decrease the quality of student learning by discouraging students from taking risks. So students have been shown to take the easiest path in order to minimize the chance of failure, get more A's, and keep their GPAs high. This is one of my favorite things that I found in an ungraded system is that students have been telling me in their reflections meetings that they're more likely to take risks in my ungraded system, which is kind of fun to see. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Grades, despite our best efforts as instructors, are just inconsistent. This kind of builds off of what Anna was saying, right? Especially when it comes to writing and other disciplines that require assessment of more subjective skills and assignments. It's also been proven that grades don't accurately communicate very much to students about what they have or haven't actually learned. Students just see the A, B, C, D and internalize that, but it doesn't really communicate to them what they have achieved or what they still need to learn. Many of you, I'm sure, have probably felt this in some way, but grades can harm relationships, not just between teachers and students, but among students themselves as well. So grades can make teaching feel more adversarial rather than collaborative, especially in high achieving cultures where grades are really important to students, like at Northwestern. I certainly felt this way before I started using alternative assessment frameworks in my classes. But grades can also foster these unhealthy competition between peers, right? Especially when students are graded on a curve or comparatively in any way. This can create stress and anxiety in the classroom and harm students' sense of community and collegiality in their courses. Grades encourage cheating. When students are worried about grades at all costs, cheating is going to happen. That's what scholar Susan Bloom says. And then again, I think most of us in this room, especially those of you who have participated in the UDL core sessions, especially that first one that's talking all about the stress and anxiety that our students are under these days, grades stress students out, and they create a lot of unhealthy anxiety and pressure around learning. So there's all kinds of reasons why grades are not great for our students.
So in addition to the points that Anna and Megan made about the ways that grades fail our students, scholars of writing and language and literacy, among others, argue that grades reinforce systems of oppression. grades-based assessment practices in courses that have a writing component have been shown to uphold systemic racism and white language supremacy because, in spite of instructors' very best intentions, those evaluation systems tend to center the linguistic and cultural practices of white folks and set those sociocultural and linguistic practices as a goal that every student should aspire to and reach. And that places some students into a privileged position over others and reinforces a loop of privilege and oppression. The quote that you're seeing on the screen is one that I appreciate very much. It's from April Baker Bell's book, Linguistic Justice, Black Language Literacy, Identity, and Pedagogy. And even methods of grading that are designed to mitigate some bias, such as rubrics, can sometimes fall into that same trap of holding all students, regardless of their starting point, regardless of sociocultural and linguistic background, to a single goal mark. So what do we do instead, right? That's the question now. I want to show you just a brief statement on decolonizing the classroom by the National Council for Teachers of English. And they recommend we design assessments that allow diverse students to demonstrate mastery in diverse ways. So as you all know, right, this aligns with UDL practices and philosophies. So if we take, again, as an example, the kinds of writing classes that Megan and I teach, quality is going to look different for every student depending on their unique personal and academic backgrounds. So we design courses around learning outcomes and assessment practices that emphasize students' engagement with the course and with our assignments, and also an individual student's growth from, for example, one draft to the next, one assignment to the next, and over the course of a full quarter, rather than some absolute quality of a final product. So there's the why. Now we're going to move on to the how, and Veronica's going to start our discussion of some approaches.
Yeah, so grades, absolutely problematic, inaccurate for all those reasons that we just talked about. But now we need to know, what do we do about it? We're still expected to enter a grade at the end of the quarter for every student in our class. So we're going to go through now a couple of different examples and some definitions of different schools of thought with ungrading. So they might seem like very different approaches that we're going to outline now, but in some ways that they are, but there's a lot of room for overlap and some themes that run throughout. And I encourage you, as you're starting to think about your own course here, to get creative and think about how you could combine different ways, or take a little from column A and a little from column B that fit for your classroom. There are even people who do multiple grading schemes in a single class. So having students elect to be graded in one way or another. So the first definition here that we are looking at is specifications and competency grading. So this is a model of ungrading that's going to chart out the entire term, quarter, whatever, with clear and detailed expectations for students. So it's kind of like saying at the very beginning, a student earning an A will have these specific qualities, a student earning a B will have these specific qualities, etc. So making those goalposts super clear and super specific, so that students kind of know what they're aiming for and know ahead of time the standards that they'll be compared to. Courses that use specifications grading have built-in ways to incorporate revisions for assignments or resubmissions, so that students can work to achieve those qualities that they want for their final grade. So if there's those revision opportunities, they can work towards the skill sets that they want and really build off of their experience. Specifications allow students also to often move along at their own pace. And whatever goal they hit at the end of the term, it's very clear what their letter grade will be. So they can kind of build their own timeline with their schedule, their progress. They have a lot of control over how they progress through the course. And they're also able then to move on to more advanced material as they wish. So there's a little bit of flexibility and control given over to the student in that respect. So this model really encourages a growth mindset because students are kind of tracking their progress to a greater goal, which is one of those expert level skills that we want all of our students to achieve. And it also reduces that implicit bias in grades overall because we're comparing to those standards.
So I'm going to talk next about ungrading. And I really like the way that Jesse Stummel talks about ungrading. He says, it's not just not grading, it's questioning the whole system of grades as an ongoing process. And there are a lot of ways in which ungrading is implemented. What we have up on the slide here are some general principles that seem to be shared among folks who use ungrading. So one of those is that we decenter grades by keeping grades as far away from students for as long as possible. So, although we have to assign grades at the end of the quarter, maybe we don't put number or letter grades on individual assignments. But we do engage students in discussions about grading and assessment, especially critical discussions. For example, we might talk to them about the grading system that we're using and how we justify that decision. We might, discuss how it's unfamiliar to them and sort of help them to become more comfortable with it. Now, at the same time as we're not putting grades on individual assignments in many ungraded classes, we are giving a lot of qualitative and formative feedback throughout a course and this is, should specifically be feedback that students can take action on. For example, to revise an assignment, between drafts, or to transfer learning from one assignment to the next. And many ungrading approaches I've seen also focus on providing for students multiple kinds and sources of feedback. Again, taking, my classes, for example, in addition to getting feedback from me, from the instructor, students are also getting feedback from their peers. They're also using self-reflection to review their own work and growth. And all of that might come in different forms, like written feedback combined with face-to-face conversations. So there's this great book by Susan Bloom. I'm sure some of you have read or at least heard of this. One thing I really like about this book is that it gives perspectives and practices on ungrading from instructors in really a wide variety of fields. So there are faculty from anthropology, from writing, philosophy, math, chemistry. So we're also seeing a lot of folks grading on engagement and completion. And as with all of the approaches that we're mentioning, there's overlap here, right? So you might see this as an aspect of ungrading or contract grading. And this approach, as you can probably imagine, focuses on students just engaging in tasks or assignments. For example, they do a first draft, they engage in peer review, they write some reflection, and they do a final draft, and they get full credit for the paper, again, without focusing on holding everyone to the same standard for that final deliverable. Often in this approach, there might be several ways to complete or engage in a task. For example, a complete in participation might come for some students from talking, in the large group discussion with the whole class. For others, maybe it's contributing to a small group discussion or posting responses to the discussion board on Canvas. For yet others, it's some combination of those tasks that gets them the complete. And next, I want to talk briefly about grading contracts. Again, there are a lot of different kinds of contracts. The way that we're using the term grading contracts here comes largely from the work of Peter Elbow, Asao Inouye, and Jane Danielowitz. So most contracts will identify expectations about requirements for each potential grade, almost like an assignment rubric, but for the broader course grade. And those grading contracts are really one more way to bring students into the conversation about grades by having them participate actively in reading and acknowledging the details of the grading system, and also to indicate shared understandings of the assessment system. Many contracts are based on engagement and completion. So for example, I've seen a lot of contracts that say something like complete 7 of these 9 quizzes and you get an A, or you get full credit for the quiz portion of our class, or do 5 Canvas discussion posts over the course of the quarter and you get full credit for asynchronous participation. And then there's also many that will combine engagement with something like accuracy or standards-based assessment as well. So Megan now is going to talk about a couple more definitions.
Yeah, thanks so much. So independent learning plans are another tool that instructors might use to increase equity and student agency in their learning. And individual learning plans, individual development plans, they have different acronyms. These are basically self-reflective documents that are designed to help students consider how goals for a particular course or program of study fit into their larger educational, professional, personal, or extracurricular goals. So ILPs are that's what I call them, ILPs, independent learning plans, are increasingly used in business contexts as a way for professionals to articulate the trajectory of their career goals at their different companies. I've seen them used for incoming PhD and med school students to kind of articulate their larger career and personal life goals for entering these big programs of study. Individual education plans also have a long history that exists in primary and secondary education contexts, especially in relation to special ed. But in both kind of professional and academic terms, the ILP is a document that exists in collaboration with an instructor or mentor and is revised throughout the term or course of study. And this is something that I use in my classes, and then I'm going to talk about in just a few seconds in more detail. So we can go ahead and flip on to the next big component of many alternative assessment plans in class. And these kind of hinge on a combination of self-assessment and self-reflection. And both of these tools, again, are really helpful in increasing equity and student agency in the classroom. So they're slightly different, but of course, completely related. So self-assessment is this reflective process whereby students are evaluating their own writing or learning in a course. So this method shares instructional power, right, as it assumes that students are the experts of their own learning and can explain and describe what they've learned in more personal ways than their professor could if we were just grading for them and assessing for them. And then self-reflection is the pedagogical tool in which students reflect on both the processes and products of their learning and about themselves as learners. For me, I kind of use them in tandem, right? So students self-assess their work, but as they're doing so, they write a self-reflection on what they've learned as they are assessing the final product that they're submitting. And reflection has been proven to help students learn more deeply, both about the concepts of the course, but about themselves as learners and how they learn and what works for them as they're learning and what doesn't, which is really kind of valuable information. Especially for me, I teach a lot of first-year students. I'm constantly trying to get them to pay attention to how they're learning and what makes sense for them as they're learning so that they can take those skills and those understandings with them into courses down the line. Okay, I think we're going to switch now into some case studies. I hope this will be kind of fun. So as Veronica kind of mentioned in her introduction, there's a lot of different ways that instructors can implement alternative assessment into their classes. And you can do it in bits and parts and column A, column B, a little bit of everything. And I think Veronica and I both use pretty different kind of approaches. So it'll be fun for us to kind of compare a little bit. I'll start and then hop over to Veronica. Talking about my ILP. So my students assess their work throughout the quarter using a combination of an individual learning plan and then these weekly self-reflection letters that they write to me at the end of each week that I call Sunday summaries. So at the beginning of the quarter, I work with students to create an individual learning plan, which asks them to build their own learning goals within and beyond, if they want to, the course learning objectives that I've created for the course. So it invites students to reflect on their critical reading, writing, thinking, and research skills, among other course goals, in terms of their perceived strengths and weaknesses. And this helps them to think about where they are now academically and where they are hoping to go academically, both through the course of my class, but also it invites them to think about their longer trajectory at Northwestern. And I ask them to create their own goals that will kind of articulate where they want to grow in these different areas. And my ILP also asks students to think critically about letter grades. So students invent their own individual grading scales and criteria to rank their progress toward their learning goals according to their own values at the end of the ILP document. This is a really fun exercise. I really try to encourage students to be creative with it and to challenge and really dig deep to figure out what does an A mean to them. That, you know, they've been given A's or whatever their entire lives. This is their chance to define what it is for themselves, which is kind of a fun exercise. So I have students do this big document in the first week of the quarter. At the midterm, they revisit it, and I ask them to revisit 3 different sections of the ILP, whichever ones they want, and kind of give an update, do a reflective paragraph on where they've grown. Now that they understand how the class is working, where might they tweak some goals? Where might they get more specific about their goals? So they revisit the ILP itself at the midterm. And as they write, you know, at the end of the quarter, students will write a final reflection, which looks a lot like their ILP, but instead of setting their goals, they're evaluating how they grew and progressed towards their goals in different areas, and ultimately assign a grade to their efforts that we talk about in a final conference. And that's kind of how the ILP works broadly, but to keep them on track, because it's such a big document, it's not a thing that I want them to just write at the first week of the quarter and then never look at again, because it requires a lot of work of them, a lot of reflecting, a lot of emotional, critical thinking, reflective work. So I have them write these Sunday summaries, which are these kind of weekly self-reflection letters, right? So students will, I'll give them some kind of prompt where I ask them to reflect on some element of learning we've done throughout the week and tie it back to the goals in their ILP and how they're learning or making progress towards those goals. So I use this combination of this big learning plan plus these weekly self-reflections that help keep students in check. Okay, I think that's enough for now. I don't want to take up too much time. Veronica, you want to hop in?
Sure. Yeah. So from the other side of campus, I am working in general chemistry, as I said, in the lab courses. So myself and my co-lab director, Katie Gizmundo, developed a new way of grading within these courses. And our constraints, you know, going into this are that we have between 150 and 450 students in a classroom. And so TAs are the ones who evaluate the assignments. So it makes it a little bit tricky to have individual attention for students on that level. So we selected more of a specifications model with few modifications. So that's my cheeky little title there. But what we've done is broken down our course, our lab course, into very specific and transparent levels of mastery that we want students to accomplish. And we describe to them what that looks like for an A, for a B, for a C. So within all of those categories of the skills we want them to leave with, they basically get a grade. And then every student has the opportunity to make progress towards the mastery. It's completely independent of all the other students in the class. So it's not like we're comparing students to each other. We're moving away from the curve sort of model that you see often in STEM courses. And students are definitely not compared to each other. So the next slide is a picture of the document that we actually use and give to students. And students are tracking their own grades throughout the course. So they're submitting these post-lab assignments that are all writing, but we break down the assignment into specific skills that we want them to have. So every assignment has a question that's about safety or techniques. Every assignment has a question that's about experimental design, et cetera, et cetera. So we have these skills listed, and then students receive feedback about each of these skills and how they've discussed the techniques of the week. So they get a grade of excellent, good, or not quite for every week, and they can track their progress as they go. And so maybe they see, safety and techniques, I've been seeing a lot of feedback that tells me I'm thinking about this in an excellent way. Great. Maybe I can put my focus on the data analysis next week. So it tells them essentially what skills they are mastering effectively and what skills need more help. So if they're tracking their grade along as the course goes on, at mid-quarter, they can come into office hours and say, I'm really happy with my my analysis of the techniques, but I'm not happy with how I've been analyzing data. And so that starts a conversation that's a lot more productive than I got 5 points off here. Why, right? It's decentering that grade mindset and turning it more into getting them focused on the skills that we want to see a Gen Chem student leave our courses with. So the end of the quarter, they wind up with a little bit of feedback for each skill. And they even see, maybe they improve their data analysis, but they know that they're moving on to organic chemistry, needing to work on the presentation of results, whatever it is. But they are getting feedback on the skills, and then they can carry that into their next courses. So that's sort of the idea that we implemented, and it is doable with the use of TAs as being the people who assess on a excellent, good, or not quite sort of scale.
So sort of reflect on your own teaching practices, your grading practices. And is there one change that you might think of implementing in the next year to make your grading and assessment systems more inclusive?
And as a way of concluding our discussion, we want to point you to some resources that we've posted on our Canvas page. So some additional resources for grading and evaluating, writing. The module that Megan shared with you is there, and that has links to all kinds of additional resources in it. So that has links to like examples of grading contracts. It has a couple of big reading lists. It has examples of like syllabus statements that you might use. And then Veronica has added a grade tracker as requested. And then there's some other resources as well, some readings that we mentioned here. So I want to just wrap us up here by saying that this is really an ongoing project for all four of us who were part of this session today, and also for the units and fields that we're situated in. So it's something that we're really excited about, and we thank you for being here today.